The Congresswoman.
I applaud the gentleman for New Jersey for his view that we need to have tied to an increase in the national debt, a mechanism that will begin to address this problem. One of the mechanisms is one that you mentioned that you support, and that would be legislation that would create a commission to begin to advise us on this structural deficit. And this chart illustrates why this structural deficit is so much worse than it's ever been. And one of the points in this chart you brought up in your discussion, and that was the point right here. This is the years when we had the Clinton presidency and a Republican Congress, and you saw tax revenues increasing over expenditures as a percentage of GDP and creating the very surplus that you discussed. But what's really interesting about this chart is the fact that it runs from the 1970s, actually from the year 1969 to 2009, so it's a 40-year chart that compares spending to GDP, taxes to GDP, and then the deficit to GDP. And the amazing thing is that when you look at gross domestic product, that is the value of everything we produce in this country every year, and use that as your constant. So we're comparing that over 40 years to the way that Congress has spent money, the way that Congress has taken in taxes, and then to the deficit. What you see is remarkable stability for 40 years. It's always hovered around a little over 20% of GDP in terms of spending, and around 18% in terms of taxes. So there has been a structural deficit for all those years of roughly 2.4%, meaning for about 40 years we've taken in a little bit less in taxes than we've taken in than we've spent. And so it's created some deficits over time. But even the deficits have hovered within that average of about 2.4%. The average then is this dotted line down here. Remarkably stable over 40 years. Now, look at what's happening in the future. These are projections. The sources are the Congressional Budget Office and the Office of Management and Budget. So we're talking about government agencies that are projecting this. Here's the line for where we begin the next decade, starting in January. Spending and taxes separate dramatically. As you can see, the year 2009, which is illustrated by this tremendous separation right here, this is where we are now. And the reason we've taken in less taxes is because of the recession. But the reason that we've spent so much are all the bills that we discussed from the beginning of this hour. It's just become completely out of the realm of anything we've ever seen in the last 40 years. So that creates a structural deficit, meaning a very, very wide gap going forward between taxes and spending. This gap is projected by CBO to be between 5 and 6%. That's more than twice of what it's ever been over the last 40 years. And it goes on and on from there. And so you can see this projected deficit in the decade coming forward. Down here is an enormous gap over what it's been. That is what you were talking about when you said, will we give our children a better country than we received? And there's a real question about that now. And that's why we have to address it. I know you're on a committee where Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke has come, as am I, and said you've got to come up with a plan to deal with this problem, this specific problem, the structural deficit. This is the structural deficit, and it is caused by the mismatch between taxes and spending. And while we as partisans get under each other's skin by saying, Democrats, you've spent too much, and the Democrats saying, Republicans, you gave spending or tax cuts at a time when we were at war. Well, we're both right. And now here we are. I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Madam Speaker, the fact that for a generation spending has been at roughly 20% of GDP for 40 years is noteworthy. And the chart that Congresswoman Lummis has is extremely informative and revealing. However, we're entering a new era where